You may have seen that Trump put out a statement online insisting that even though he's not in control yet, even though the Democrats right now control the White House, President Joe Biden is still president, even though the Democrats right now have a majority in the Senate, still Trump insisting this weekend that the Democrats should not be allowed to confirm anyone, including any Biden-appointed judges over these next 2.5 months before Trump is actually sworn in as president. And as an assertion, that's nuts, right? You're not president now, my guy. And Republicans don't control the Senate right now. So you and Republicans have no control. You have no say over whether or not Biden and the Democrats choose to pass more confirmations before you take power. You don't get a say in that. You're not in power yet. And to be clear, after Biden won the presidential election in 2020 and Democrats won the Senate at the same time, when the Republicans were on their way out of power and they knew it, they had a gazillion confirmations. They confirmed at least 32 people in that time period after the 2020 election, everything from the Surface Transportation Board to the State Department to the Federal Reserve to the DOJ to the Tennessee Valley Authority. They confirmed more than 30 people to jobs like that after Biden and the Democrats won the 2020 election, but before Trump and the Republicans had left town and handed over power. They confirmed tons of people after they lost the election in 2020. Before the Democrats came into power at the end of January 2025. The idea that it would be somehow improper now for the Democrats to do the same thing, for the Democrats to spend this next 2.5 months confirming Biden nominees, including judges, say that there's something wrong with that, or Republicans should stop that, or the Republicans can stop that. It's just an absurd suggestion. Republicans confirmed people at great speed after they lost power in 2020. Democrats will do so, presumably with equivalent speed right now after they lost this election. The White House at least said they would do so today in a statement brushing Trump back, telling him to back off his threats to try to stop these confirmations even before he is back in power. But here's the thing that I really want to point to here. Along with that absurd bluster from Trump, where he's trying to pretend he's already in power, right? Telling Democrats to behave as if Trump's already president and Republicans already control the Senate, which they don't. Aside from that, which is pushing it, big guy, Trump also said one other thing about confirming people for positions in the government. He said he wants the new Senate, once they're sworn in January, to go into recess. He wants them to recess, to leave town, so that there's no Senate in session to confirm his nominees for the new administration. Now, on the surface level, you might think this makes no sense. Republicans are going to control the Senate when they're back in January. It's not like Trump-era Republicans are known for their independence and their willingness to buck Trump's wishes, right? Whoever Trump wants to appoint to his government, no matter how crazy, the Republicans in the Senate are going to approve everyone he asks for. What do you think? They're going to be offended, right? Somebody like Tom Homan, oh, he's been spending time with the Jews did 9/11 guy. You think that Republicans in the Senate are going to have a problem with that? Really? I mean, he's going to have a Republican-controlled Senate. They will confirm his appointees no matter who they are. So why is Trump now telling the Senate to go into recess, to shut themselves down so they can't vote to confirm his appointees? Why is he doing that? He's doing that so the Senate won't have to vote to confirm his appointees. If the Senate is in recess, he can make recess appointments. He can just install people in their positions without the Senate ever voting for them, even though the Senate would definitely vote for them if they took a vote. He's telling the United States Senate to shut itself down so he can operate independently and on his own. Even though they don't have any intention of stopping him, he doesn't even want to give them a say. I draw your attention to this because of all the discussion we have had as a country about Trump's, dictator on day one promises, his, authoritarian values and promises and threats. One of the things that hasn't been talked about very much is that we have a three-part system of government. Right? Co-equal branches of government, the judiciary, the legislature, and the executive. We have a three-part system of government. But what's the first rule of authoritarianism? It's that there's one guy in charge, right? It's that there can be no other source of authority in the government other than the dear leader. So if there has to be a Congress, well, it certainly shouldn't be a Congress with any power. It shouldn't be a Congress that has any role in governing. And frankly, same thing for the courts, right? This is something that I've been trying to raise flags about in advance. And so sometimes you can just feel something is getting traction or not getting traction. Like, you can tell this is not getting traction. But I'm just going to keep saying it because this is what's coming. We're already seeing it. Watch for moves early on to consolidate power for him, not just within the executive branch, which they are obviously doing. Right? This whole thing about firing all the civil servants, firing all the career government employees. What's that about doing? It's about consolidating the executive branch so there's no source of authority and no directive force in the executive branch at all other than the president himself. That is about consolidating the power of the executive branch. But also look to him to disempower, to hollow out, to neuter, to sideline the other two branches of government. The legislature, meaning the Congress, and the judiciary. Trump does not fear being constrained by this iteration of Congress, right? Especially if the Republicans take the House as well. Trump doesn't fear being all that constrained by courts, not with John Roberts as Chief Justice on this Supreme Court. He does not fear being constrained by those parts of our government in anything he wants to do. He's got them both on choke chains, frankly. But it is important to any would-be authoritarian to not just have the obedience of other portions of the government. He needs to have their subservience too. It must be that other portions of the government cannot matter. Only he can matter. There can't be three co-equal branches of government. There can be one man who is the government and everything else is subservient to him. And on this point, amid everything else we are learning about this transition, and oh boy, there is more to learn about it. We're going to talk about it this hour. But amid everything else we are learning about this transition, stick a flag in the fact that he is demanding that the U.S. Senate shut itself down for him, even though it's going to be controlled by Republicans. There is no rational reason why he should not want the United States Senate to confirm his appointees unless he doesn't want the Senate to have that kind of job. He doesn't want the Senate or the Congress to have any job, frankly. L'État, c'est moi, right? The state, that's me. Authoritarian governance means only one person matters, and the rest of the government is just decoration. We are watching for that from him about the courts. We are already seeing it from him about what he is demanding from the Congress. Heads up.